There is a photo on my phone that I did not take. It is time-stamped a Tuesday in November, 6:47 in the evening. It shows the living room of my apartment from the corner near the window, my couch, my coffee table, my TV, the lamp on the side table that I leave on when I go out at night. I am not in the photo. Nobody is. It is just my apartment, empty and lit, taken from inside by someone who was standing in my living room while I was not home. I have no explanation for how it got there. I have asked everyone I know, and nobody put it there. I have been through every possibility I can think of, and none of them hold. The detective I showed it to filed a report, and I have not heard back. That photo is the last piece of what happened, and it is the piece I keep coming back to late at night when I cannot sleep. I want to tell you the whole story in order, so the photo makes sense when you get to it. Because on its own, it is just a picture. But after everything else that happened, it is the most disturbing thing I have ever seen. My family has owned a cabin in rural Michigan since before I was born. My grandfather built it in the late 70s on about 4 acres of land off a dirt road that doesn't have a name, just a county number. It's about 2.5 hours from where I grew up, and we used it every summer when I was a kid, sometimes in the fall for deer season, occasionally in winter if someone felt like making the drive. By the time I was in my 20s, we weren't going as much. My grandfather passed, my parents got older, and the cabin mostly sat empty through the colder months. We kept it maintained. My dad would drive up twice a year to check on things, make sure the pipes hadn't frozen, clear any damage from fallen branches. It was still ours. We just weren't there as often. I got the call on a Tuesday morning in late January. It was my dad. He said the cabin was on fire and that someone had already called it in and that the county fire department was on the way. He said he'd gotten a call from a neighbor about a 1/4 mile up the road who had seen the smoke. I asked him if he knew how it started, and he said he had no idea because nobody had been up there since October. I was closer than he was, so I told him I'd go. I left within 20 minutes. By the time I got there, the fire had been going for a while. The 2-lane dirt road leading in was marked with a fire department truck and a county sheriff's vehicle parked at angles, blocking the entrance. A deputy let me through when I told him it was my family's property. I parked behind the truck and walked the last 100 yards to the cabin on foot. The building was mostly gone. The roof had already collapsed inward, and the walls on the far side were down. The firefighters were working the perimeter to stop it from spreading into the dry brush around it, but they weren't trying to save the structure because there was nothing left to save. The snow around the cabin had melted in a wide circle from the heat, and the smoke rising off the collapsed walls was thick and black. I stood at the edge of what used to be the front yard, and I watched it for a while. One of the firefighters came over and introduced himself and said they'd arrived about 40 minutes earlier. He asked if there was anyone who could have been inside, and I told him no. The cabin had been empty since fall. He said that was consistent with what they were seeing, that there was no indication of anyone in the structure. Then he said something that took me a second to process. He said, "Your neighbor up the road wasn't the one who called it in. By the time he saw the smoke and phoned, we were already en route. Somebody else called it in first." I asked who. He said an anonymous 911 call from a cell phone, no name given, and that the caller had simply said there was a fire at the property and hung up. The dispatcher had tried to call back, and it went straight to a disconnected tone. I looked around the property while the firefighters worked. Off to the left, maybe 60 feet from where I was standing, was the edge of the tree line where the property met a stretch of state forest. I noticed a figure standing there. He was standing at the very edge of the trees, partially in shadow from the birches behind him, wearing a dark hoodie with the hood up. He was facing the fire, not moving, not on his phone, not talking to anyone, just standing there watching the cabin burn with his hands at his sides. He wasn't with the fire department. He wasn't the deputy. There was no car parked near him that I could see. I walked toward him. I don't know why exactly. Something about the way he was standing made me want to get a look at his face. I got within maybe 20 feet before he turned his head slightly, not fully toward me, just enough to register that I was approaching. Then he turned and walked into the trees. Not fast, not running, just walked. Within a few seconds, the birches had swallowed him, and I couldn't see him anymore. I told the deputy immediately. He walked the tree line for about 10 minutes and came back and said he hadn't found anyone. He took a description and said he'd noted in the report. His tone made it pretty clear he wasn't going to do much more than that. The fire investigators' report came back about 3 weeks later. The cause was determined to be an intentional ignition, accelerant used, originating from inside the cabin near the back bedroom. They classified it as arson. What came out of the investigation after that was the part that still bothers me. When they went through the debris, they found evidence that someone had been living in the cabin. Not recently moved in, but there for weeks, possibly longer. A sleeping bag, or the metal frame of one, mostly destroyed. Several food cans that hadn't been in the cabin the last time my dad had inventoried it in October. A phone charging cable fused to the wall outlet near the kitchen. A second set of tire tracks in the frozen mud of the access road that didn't match any vehicle in our family. Whoever had been staying there had let themselves in somehow, had been living there through the coldest part of winter, and had burned it on their way out. The detective assigned to the case said this kind of thing happened more than people realized, especially with remote properties that sat vacant for long stretches. Transient individuals looking for shelter, sometimes people avoiding someone. He said in most cases they never identified who it was. He seemed to be preparing us for the likelihood that nobody would ever be held accountable, which turned out to be correct. The case is still listed as open with no suspect identified. What I haven't told my dad yet, because I don't know how to say it, is what I found 2 weeks after the fire when I was going through the photos on my phone. I was looking back through pictures from a birthday dinner at my apartment in November, about 2 months before the fire, trying to find one I wanted to send to my sister. While I was scrolling, I stopped on a photo I didn't take. It was in my camera roll, time-stamped a week before the birthday dinner, showing the living room of my apartment from the corner near the window. My couch, my coffee table, my TV, taken from inside my apartment while I wasn't home. I have never shown that photo to anyone, and I have no explanation for how it got there. I changed my locks in February. I had a security system installed the following week. I've gone back over every detail I can remember from the weeks before the fire. Every time I might have left my door unlocked. Every person I gave a spare key to, and I can't account for it. The detective said it was worth filing an additional report, which I did, and which has also gone nowhere. The one thing I keep coming back to is the figure at the tree line. The way he was standing when I first saw him. The way he turned and walked into the woods before I could get close enough to see his face. He called the fire in, and then he stood at the edge of the property and watched it burn. And when I walked toward him, he left. He didn't run. He just left, at exactly the pace of someone who knows they don't need to hurry. I don't know who he was. I don't know how long he was in that cabin before he burned it. I don't know how he got the photo onto my phone or when he was in my apartment or how many times. I don't know if he found somewhere else to stay after the cabin was gone. I think about that last part more than anything else.